And so the Bretton Woods system ended there in 71. Now, the dollar, of course, immediately collapsed. When a politician says, I'm going to defend the dollar by doing this, you know the dollar's going to collapse.
Of course.
And that's what it... So then America, it didn't want to play ball because that would have meant a bit of austerity and actually reducing the American footprint in the world. American military bases all over the world had to be paid for. And suddenly, you know, with this situation, American influence in the world normally should have shrunk and would have shrunk. But they came up with a different idea, and that's where the inflation of the 70s comes in. So they came up with the idea, okay, so the fundamental problem is Germany, Japan, exporting nations, they're not buying enough from America. Well, if we can't sell them stuff, what do they need? What do they need? Oh, they need energy. They need oil. So, okay, who's producing oil? America wasn't exporting that much oil, but who was the biggest exporter of oil? Saudi Arabia. Okay, so the Americans went to Saudi Arabia. Henry Kissinger went there to speak with the leadership, and essentially they made a deal. The deal is now, I mean, it took a long time for the whole deal to become known because they kept the secret. The deal was this. It was basically a protection racket. America arrived with its troops and said to the Al Saud family, royal family in Saudi Arabia, we've got a nice kingdom here. It would be a shame if you suddenly lost power to some revolutionary group, right? Like they're doing today in Syria. You know, we've got American troops in Syria occupying the oil fields and stealing the oil, right? It'd be a shame if this happened to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, there would be a shame. Well, we're going to protect you. We're going to put American troops into Saudi Arabia, and we'll make sure you'll stay in power and everything is fine. Okay. Well, if you, it's a deal, you know, if you do the following. If you, from now on, sell oil to anyone only against the US dollar. And of course, then you'll get so many dollars. You also need to then get some advice on how to invest these dollars. And the deal is, look, 80% of that, it'd be billions and billions and billions. 80% of that, you have to invest in US treasuries. And so then it comes back and it funded also the huge, that's the double deficit, you know. It's not just the trade deficit, current account deficit, but it's also the government budget deficit with the military operations and covert budgets, huge trillions of dollars spent on who knows what. And that's how the money then was recycled back to America. Now, this was the real story. But to hide this story, they needed some distraction, and that's when they created this inflation. So all the central banks from 71, 72, in these crucial years when this deal was being prepared, they massively expanded their money creation. They were told by America, it's okay, you create lots of money. America was creating money, but the others were also told to create money, so the American money creation is suddenly not so noticeable, you see. Even the Bundesbank was creating a lot of money, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan creating massive amounts of money. So suddenly the Fed doesn't look so bad with the dollar creation. And then they staged this Middle Eastern war in October 73, and Henry Kissinger persuaded finally in January 74 the Saudi oil minister to quadruple the oil price. And then all the headlines since then ever have been about, oh, the 70s inflation, well, that's the oil shock, you know, it's these Arab countries increasing the oil price. When the real story is, it was arranged to cover up the change in the global monetary system, switching from the gold standard to the petrodollar. Mm-hmm. And that brings us back to now, because it looks like we're in this similar phase now where we're switching from the petrodollar, which clearly is in its last, you know, stage. Petrodollar is ending. You know, Saudi Arabia has already been selling oil recently. I mean, it's joined the BRICS countries now just this month, which means it's joined China and Russia, and it's been selling oil against the Chinese currency. So that means the old deal has ended, and that became clear with the, when the ruling prince made this clear a few years ago, and also basically they've left this U.S. alliance. They've now made peace with Iran even, and so in the Middle East things are changing a lot. America has lost control of this, the strict rule that you must sell only raw materials and oil, and particularly energy, against the US dollar. Before, they would have many wars for that to maintain it. Saddam Hussein, there were two wars, right? First, the first Gulf War, and then basically the Iraq War. And they left Saddam Hussein alive, former CIA agents, but he was then killed in the Iraq War. That's when he had started to sell oil against the euro. Same with Gaddafi in Libya. He'd become friends again with everyone. Blair was visiting, the French president was visiting. But suddenly NATO attacked and bombed, as they did to Serbia and as well. But the peaceful, defensive NATO. But suddenly he was enemy in what was around 2011, and they killed him brutally. Why? Well, one thing he did just before then was starting to sell oil against the euro. And of course, he was also talking about an alternative African gold-based currency. So these were all attacks of the petrodollar world. But now it seems we're beyond that, and the petrodollar is ending. The rise of the BRICS, the role of China, China's Belt and Road Initiative was a big change, because basically they said we've got all these dollar reserves. We're not just going to buy treasuries. Actually, we're going to use them to buy infrastructure in the world, and we're going to invest in developing countries and help them develop, instead of holding US treasuries, which makes the Chinese, subject to American controls. In many ways, of course, the sanctions against Russia accelerated all this. So you have to see that America itself accelerated these things, either willingly or unwittingly. But when countries see, just because they disagree with Russian policies, now they've confiscated billions of dollars of Russian foreign exchange reserves. It's pretty outrageous, isn't it? I mean, other countries, well, if they suddenly decide they don't like our policies, they could just keep our foreign exchange reserves. Dollars and euros are not safe. So suddenly everyone was questioning this dollar hegemony, and now we have an alternative system on the horizon. The BRICS countries are talking about having all their trade now, and this is roughly half of world's GDP, and a lot of the oil exporters are now part of the BRICS or related to the BRICS. And also the geographical routes, Suez Canal is part of the BRICS now, with Egypt. There's Ethiopia also joining the BRICS now. So the world is changing, and it looks like, well, it seems to be a coincidence, but that's again when they have created inflation, partly to distract from this shift in the global currency system. So what is the new system? Well, we have these creation of these new blocks. There's the US-EU bloc, or you might call it the Five Eyes plus EU bloc, because, of course, the Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, in there as well, UK and EU, which is actually small because the rest of the world seems to be going with the BRICS, and most of Africa seems to be backing Russia rather than antagonizing Russia. So that's the one thing. And the other, from a US perspective, from the empire perspective, what is the new currency system they are proposing? Well, central bank digital currencies.
Oh, now, you said destruction. We had something different here. We had pandemics also.
Yes.
And they said 2 lockdowns or 3 lockdowns even, they also disrupt economy. Is this
Absolutely.
kind of destruction what they needed?
Well, certainly. It seems to be very much consistent with these plans. And of course, if you look at at this COVID psyop that became sort of official and public in March 2020, there was, of course, significant preparation beforehand. Event, what was it? Event 201, I think it was called, in New York, with all the usual players, Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, and so on. World Economic Forum, playing through these things. And then the degree of coordination of very strange, often very silly and very useless policies tells you, I mean, similar to the central bank policies, I mean, they're all doing the same very strange, unusual, and medically not justified things. I mean, medicine used to be different, In medicine, you don't quarantine healthy people. You don't even test healthy people when there's no symptom. But suddenly that was gone, and so many countries in the world were adopting these very strange, very unusual policies that simply ignored all the actual protocols that had been developed ready for some epidemic or pandemic. They were suddenly gone, and it was this new approach which seemed to be very centrally controlled. So that tells you, there's some conscious planning had been going on, and if you look for that, you'll find plenty of evidence. Now, it seems to me that because also when this happened in March 2020, immediately there was a push by central banks for CBDCs under the very silly argument that, well, the virus is on paper, cash will be a carrier of the virus, which is medical nonsense.
Of course.
But that was sort of the cover story, and suddenly they talked about the need for digital IDs and the rollout of central bank digital currencies, which seems to be connected to this. Which seems to be connected to the COVID pass and all that.
Let's go through all this. Now, new policy can be, because they offer already and is implementation, central bank digital currency. Can you explain it? What exactly means that?
Yes. Central bank digital currency is, the way it's presented to us is as something new. And of course, in a way, it is new. But let's not forget, bank digital currencies, BDC, bank digital currencies, we've been using for many decades in the banking system. It's a payment system. We have certainly in Europe and in most countries in the world, we have very well-functioning digital payment systems, and they work. And so actually when consulting companies like McKinsey looked at this central bank digital currency, I saw one study where they say, well, we don't actually see the need for this CBDC because, what is it adding? There's even some Federal Reserve bankers, right. Neil Kashkari in the US, I think Federal Reserve Bank of Minnesota, yes. He's saying it's a solution for a problem we don't have. We don't need this. And that's true. So that again...
Except if you want control all the transactions like Chinese do.
Yeah, exactly. Which is true. Which is exactly true. So, in other words, the official rationale that we need this because it will do X, Y, Z, that's not really true. We've been using digital currency already for a long time, bank digital currency. So what is the difference? It's the C, central bank digital currency, the centralization aspect. So far, actually, the systems we've had, and we've talked about banking, is a system where we have decentralized money creation. And in countries with many banks, and some countries have many, many small banks, that's actually a very healthy and very good system. Because it means that a local community, they will have their local community bank, headquartered locally, making the decisions locally, and they are creating money when they lend. And of course, it's so crucial, the decision that is made by the bankers, who is getting the new money, how much money are they getting, and for what purpose? These are crucial questions, and if you have a decentralized system, it works very well, very effectively. But decentralization also means that the central planners at the central banks don't have that much power, and they always have to manipulate the banks into things, which they've been quite good at, but it looks like they want to centralize their power even more. Now, before we come to that, maybe it's also important to understand just the benefits of the system that we have currently, because basically it's under threat. The CBDCs are threatening our banking system, and they will change things. Now, some people say, well, banks are bad and big banks are bad, so good riddance to them. But watch out what you're saying, because the alternative is likely to be worse, because there will be fewer people with even more power, central power and control over all transactions. And that is unprecedented powers in the hands of a small number of de facto dictators. This has never happened in history, so it is quite scary. But before we come to that, quickly, just to explain the benefits of a decentralized banking system, the best case in point is China. Because China used to be a Soviet economy under Mao, Chairman Mao. Very Soviet style, central planning, and like the Soviet Union for much of its history, it had only one bank, Gosbank, the central bank, no other bank. Of course, the central bank had many branches and so on, but there was only one bank. And that was the system. For the central planners, it was convenient. They didn't have to worry about other banks. And the central bank was controlled by the central planners and could make top-down decisions how to allocate resources, who gets money and whose money will be taken. And that's how central bankers love it. But the system does not deliver economic performance. It doesn't deliver for the people. It doesn't deliver prosperity for everyone because it's too centralized. I mean, it's quite clear. Who's going to be better? A small number of people that decide for the whole country how much money will be created and who in the whole country will get the newly created money, for what purpose. That is totalitarianism. Now, Deng Xiaoping came to power in China in 1978. That was after Mao. And he was very much aware of the importance of this question. And of course, he also was interested in empirical facts. He was essentially a scientific economist. He even said, we need to forget about ideology and politics. Let's do what works, what empirically works, which is what scientific economics, what I'm trying to do, is all about. And he went to Japan. He asked them, what's your secret of growth, of high growth, double-digit economic growth? The Japanese told him. And he came back from Japan. And what was the main big thing he did? I mean, he did quite a few reforms, but the key difference to before was, before they had a centralized banking system like Soviet Union. But now he went out and created thousands of banks, local banks, small banks, credit unions, savings banks, regional banks, provincial banks, of course a few also bigger banks, but the majority, I mean, created 5,000 banks. At some stage you could argue even many more if you count a smaller type of credit unions as well. Thousands and thousands of banks. And because banks create money, this is decentralizing power. It's saying, no, we think it's more effective if, instead of 5 people in a central planning committee, we've got 5,000 banks. Each bank has 100 branches, and each branch has 100 loan officers. And they go to, literally now do the calculation, millions of companies. And they get loan applications. They check. They go to see the company. They discuss, could this work, could this not work? They kick the tires, and they make the decision. So you've got hundreds of thousands of money creators on the ground in a decentralized way in each local village, making the decisions. That is going to be superior to 5 central planners that do it for the whole country, of course. In fact, that is the difference between a Soviet central planning economy and successful capitalism. It is, well, it's private ownership, of course, is one thing as an incentive, and the other thing is the decentralization of the money creation through the banking system. So all successful major economies have lots and lots of banks. America has over 5,000 banks. The largest number of banks in Europe is in Germany. And it's these thousands of cooperative banks, local community banks. Their headquarters is in a local village. That also means there's accountability. The big banks, when any organization gets very large, it becomes out of control and they start to do very bad decisions. It basically goes back to human nature. Power gives you a lot of temptations. Most people cannot handle the temptations of power. and it becomes, talking about corruption is almost the milder aspect of the problem. It's much worse than that. Once you have somebody in power that has a lot of power without real accountability, which is true for most large organizations, you just get disastrous results. Whereas if you have a local small bank, the locals see what the bank is doing. If they suddenly want to fund some really bad foreign polluting, industrial company that wants to build a huge polluting plant there, the locals will tell the bankers, to say, no, we don't want this, don't you do this. And the opposition will be so strong, it cannot happen, it will not happen. So you've got this accountability in a decentralized banking system. And of course, what was the result of the reforms of Deng Xiaoping? Hugely successful. 40 years of double-digit economic growth. China moved from a developing country to an economic and political superpower, challenging the US now, de facto. The US feels challenged, let's put it that way. And more people lifted out of poverty than in any place and any time in history before. So hugely successful through a decentralized banking system. But our leaders in the West are saying, no, we need the opposite. What has the ECB done? Since its creation, it's only 23 years old. It's killed more than 5,000 banks. The ECB policies in this time have been consistently anti-bank policies to reduce profit margins in banks that do the productive business lending, the small banks, forcing them to merge. Now they've created this ESM, European Stability Mechanism, which is another supranational organization out of control, similar status to the ECB, that can close down banks in the whole of Europe anytime without recourse. You can't do anything against it. They can just say so. They've been given by treaty this power. And so these are preparations, because really what's going to happen is, and this is the next point about CBDCs, as you introduce central bank digital currencies, this is really the central bankers ripping up this agreement that's existed for centuries between the central bank and the banks, namely that the central bank is like a wholesale bank. It deals only with the banks, and the banks deal with the public. And that gives us a very decentralized economy. The central planners are now saying, we want more power. And they're saying, we want to deal with the public directly. We're offering central bank digital currency. That means you can have an account at the central bank, essentially. So we don't need the banks, is what the central banks are saying. And the reality is, because the central bankers are regulators of the banks, it's unfair competition. If the regulator suddenly says to you, I'm going to compete against you, the regulated, you have no chance. And now that the ECB and other central banks are saying they want to introduce central bank digital currencies, we have to look at the past 15, 20 years of their policies in a different light, because they're now admitting they want to compete against the banks. Well, their policies have been anti-bank. Interest rate policies, the regulatory policies, huge regulatory burdens put on small banks in Europe. In America, the small banks get a different regulator and lighter regulation because proportionality, they're small. Why do you need such complex regulation? In Europe, the smallest credit union with 10 staff has to follow the same rules as Deutsche Bank. This is crazy. Therefore, thousands have been forced to close. They essentially have to merge with other banks, and the number of banks has been declining. That's what they've been doing. So now we just need, for them to introduce CBDCs, we just need another banking crisis, which is very easy to arrange for these guys because they've got all the levers in their hands now. And when the next banking crisis comes, and they've given us a little bit of a glimpse with Silicon Valley Bank in America, how they can do it. That was very much orchestrated.
Signature Bank also. Yeah,
Signature Bank and Silvergate Bank, these three. And certainly with Silicon Valley Bank, it's very clear, it was very much orchestrated because there was no need for that bank to be closed. The Fed was created on the ticket that when a banking crisis comes, the Fed can step in. That's why we need a central bank, because America didn't have a central bank for much of its history, right? It was only created in 1913. On this explanation, a reluctant Congress agreed to have a Fed. But the Fed didn't act. Did it step in when Silicon Valley suddenly needed liquidity? No, the Fed didn't step in. In fact, the Fed Now system accelerated the draining of money from Silicon Valley Bank so that it could then be forced closed. And then once it was closed and taken over, then the Fed gave liquidity, you know. Yeah. So it was a takeover. But essentially, once you have a banking crisis, then the money will quickly switch. If you have also CBDCs at that time, all the money will go to the central bank digital currencies, and the banking system can be closed down, can be essentially merged into the central bank. Then we only have one bank left. I think the central planners want to be the only banks in town. That's what CBDCs is likely to do to us. But for us, it means much more than just having only one bank left. Yeah. Because CBDC is very different. The banks, you have to give them credit. They've been quite good to us. We've entrusted them with all that data on our lives, on our transactions. I don't think there's many cases where that has been abused. What is Google doing with that data? They're using that data that they have on us all the time. They're selling it. They're earning money on it by selling out our private, most private data. The bankers have not done that, you see? So, but CBDCs will be all about that our transactions will be controlled, will be monitored, and in fact, of course, essentially, it's not any more money because it's conditional money. We have to apply for a permit to the bureaucrat, to the central planner, each time you want to spend. Please, may I do this transaction? And they will hum and ha. There will be a mechanism, of course, maybe using AI to automate it, except if you're a critic, then they will personalize it. So you want to buy a piece of meat here. It's too much meat consumption, we think. Oh, this transaction, too much CO2. Yeah. CO2 is plant food, but we don't want so much plant food out in the world. Yeah. So,
carbon footprint also, it's something that we already have. But okay, let's step back. They introduced COVID passports 3 years ago, 2 years ago exactly. I said, that was my personal opinion, that it's just first step for the digital ID. Yeah. Digital ID leads to digital wallet. And when we have a central bank digital currency, we have everything to make control. What do you think about this?
Well, exactly. That's exactly it. I mean, to me, it was quite clear when they rolled out so early a COVID vaccination passport, which was basically a digital ID, when really it was clear by that time already that these so-called vaccines were not preventing transmission or a better medical outcome for the receivers of these injections. So then what's the point of this COVID passport, right? Well, it's to establish digital IDs, and it seemed they didn't care about these details. They were never interested in that. Does it work or not? Just let's roll out this digital ID. And they're now more or less saying, you know, we need digital IDs.
Okay. Very important thing. In public, somebody says that it's not possible to control this money, but as we know, this money is programmable.
Yes. Well, that is a fact. In fact, the most official version of that is probably the Bank of England's writings on this when they formally asked the government to deliberate this and essentially approve the programmability. Because they felt that as a central bank, well, it's better to get the sort of legal, you know, the procedurally get government or parliament to approve this. And so that's what they did. They had a formal request, you know, and of course the answer is yes, it will be programmable.
Why?
Well, because it's possible. Because it's possible. The central bank digital currency is attractive to central planners because it opens up whole new horizons for a central planner to exert control. And it's not just about monitoring and surveying, no, it's active active interference by controlling your every transaction. And by doing so, also where you are, because if it doesn't work when you step outside the 15-minute city, then you have to stay inside the 15-minute city, right? And so it's a tool to affect your actual spending on what, but also where you are, and how you interact with society. Can be centrally planned and controlled.
There is something called ESG. That's something for the companies. Is there a way to control the companies?
Of course, people and companies.
Environmental social governing, for
yes.
people who doesn't know this.
Yes.
Environmental social governing is a new standard and everybody has to fulfill it.
Exactly. So, and it's already happening. Basically, there's already, the tools are there. MasterCard is offering this already to companies and to individuals to have some kind of carbon audit of your financial transactions. And that can be real time. And of course, something like that can be simply, can become the permission system. And of course, there's also the possibility of social credit scoring. If you often cross the road when
we have this already in China.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and basically you can, and of course we saw this also in COVID, where a lot of these things were tried. It turns out that our governments have hired behavioral psychologists to use behavioral psychology on us. Now, what is this about? This is, to put it in plain language, manipulation. So the government doesn't openly say, we want to achieve X, Y, Z, we want you to do X, Y, Z. No, they will do certain things to you so that you react. And your reaction is what they want you to do. And it's a way of hiding that the government is actually trying to do something. So it's complete manipulation. And that also will be applied. So there will be, the argument is already being made. You want to use behavioral psychology to get people to actually behave responsibly for the sake of the climate or whatever excuse they come up with.
Let me remind everybody also that they only use this tool with Canadian truckers.
Yeah.
They froze their accounts because they were protesting against vaccine mandates. Also, they forbid one politician, Nigel Farage. They took his account because of his political views. Now they get it back, but this is the example. And also now they're pushing very hard that we are in some kind of new crisis. We're now hearing some new variants. They're pushing again masks mandates somewhere. They're telling about new vaccines. At the same time, we have huge climate crisis. And all these things can push us to the control what to do to save, for example, planet, to save others from new variant, or to take vaccine, 7th, 8th, 9th booster, because we are not safe. And now they have tools. Only what they need now to get rid of the cash. What they are planning to do with this?
Yes, exactly. Well, cash is in the way because cash is freedom. There's the famous statement by one of the central bankers from the Bank for International Settlement in Basel, where he says, well, with cash, we don't know where you're spending it and who's spending it and what the money is used for. We don't know, but with CBDC, we know all this, and we have the technology to check and actually implement our interference with this. So that's the problem with cash from their viewpoint, and that's why cash has been threatened. I mean, over the last decades already, many governments in Europe have reduced this maximum amount of cash that should be allowed for transactions, which is quite wrong, really.
We have already this.
Exactly, and the population should really complain about this because cash is legally a promissory note issued by the central bank. Why should this be restricted? It's legal. And we're not doing anything wrong, but we just have the freedom to do things without a bureaucrat being asked. And that should be
fighting terrorism, they said.
Yeah, you got to laugh, exactly. Or fighting viruses or whatever. I think we should really fight very hard to maintain cash, because as long as we have cash, everyone should use cash also for larger transactions as much as possible, the whole public, because they are always trying stuff and see what they get away with. But if we stand up and say, no, we will keep cash, and everyone does it, then we can win. We just have to do it.
Yeah. And for last, what we can expect in the next few months? Can we expect some maybe major financial crisis like we had in 2008?
Well, I think we are heading towards a crisis in a number of countries. The precise timing is tricky, of course, but in Germany, for example, I mean, I've been warning since 2009, first, that there will be an asset bubble, a property bubble, real estate bubble in Germany. That's really come to full fruition. It peaked in late last year, probably October, November. Looks like it was the peak of that property bubble. It's now deflating. And if history is a guide, and it's usually the best guide we have, then that means property prices will probably drop a lot. And if there's no sudden change in policy, if they want to let this turn into a big banking crisis, then that will happen next. Probably, I mean, the banks can probably delay it. We've seen in Japan, they managed to delay for many years. But probably within 2-3 years, there could be a major banking crisis. The goal would probably be to get rid of all the many small local community banks, which are the backbone of German economic strength, which are funding the small and medium-sized enterprises, which are very strong in Germany. It seems the plan is to deindustrialize Germany. If you look at the energy policies, many German companies now going bankrupt. Companies that are 100 years old, 150 years old, they're all closing down now because of government policies taken under US pressure. And it would fit in to really deindustrialize and destroy the German economy to now also have a banking crisis, finishing off the many small banks, which will finish off the small and medium-sized enterprises in Germany. But of course, that's a big shock to the whole European economy when this happens. But that is very much on the cards in the next few years.
And also, if this bank crisis happened, if people are losing deposits, in case they offer them to take digital wallet and they will keep their deposit and promise them in the future there will be no more bank run because there is no cash, maybe people will accept this solution.
That is, of course, the risk. Also, there will be other temptations that will be offered to us, such as universal basic income. Oh, you can get a monthly paycheck of 1,000 or 2,000 euros, but it has to be in the wallet. It has to be digital currency, central bank digital currency. That's being pushed quite hard. And again, it's a way of getting central bank digital currency widely accepted. But probably the triggering a banking crisis the fastest, because then the money will just go into CBDCs, and then they just announce cash is now not allowed anymore. That's it.
Mr. Werner, it was really a pleasure, and thank you for your time, for your research. For sure, very soon we'll have to talk again because things are happening. Every day is changing, especially in this financial sector, and we have to discuss about it because this is now time to discuss the most important thing, and that is freedom.
Indeed, I entirely agree. It's a pleasure, and I hope to be back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Evo, dragi narode, čuli ste danas puno toga. Potrebno je još više o tome razgovarati. Za one koji nisu znali kako stvari funkcioniraju, mogu provjeriti. Dakle, moj današnji gost je i publicirao sva svoja istraživanja. Tko želi pročitati, neka se sam uvjeri. Ova predviđanja, koliko god izgledaju čudno, možda izgledaju čak i nemoguća, ja bih ipak volio da ih uzmemo u obzir. Jer ako smo išta do sada saznali smo da je sve moguće. Moguće je da nas žele kontrolirati putem digitalnog novca. Moguće je da nam ukinu gotovinu. Moguće je da prate naš karbonski otisak kako bi spasili ovaj planet. Pa zbog toga je moguće da nam kontroliraju koliko ćemo pojesti mesa, koliko ćemo putovati, da li ćemo se micati iz 15-dnevnih gradova koje recimo sad imamo u implementaciji i u Zagrebu. I ne samo u Zagrebu, već u 40 gradova velikih svjetskih. Možda će nam i kontrolirati da li ćemo putovati avionima, jer najavljuju, na primjer, iz Velike Britanije da do 2029. godine neće više putovati sa otoka, iako ne znam koji je pravi razlog. Slušat ćemo sve te informacije i voditi računa o tome jer mi smo kao Hrvatska u eurozoni. Naš utjecaj na našu monetarnu politiku je otprilike ovakav. 0. To smo htjeli, to smo dobili. Sad se možemo samo nadati i biti budni i pokušati spasiti ono što se spasiti da, a to je gotovina koja nam još uvijek daje neku slobodu. Nadam se da ova naša predviđanja, ovo o čemu smo razgovarali, se neće dogoditi. Ali je sve na vama, sve je na našim gledateljima, slušateljima, kako će oni odlučiti. Hoće li zbog svog komoditeta i zbog toga što vjeruju da sve ovo što čine zbog našeg dobra, prihvatiti jednostavno novu digitalnu valutu, digitalni novčanik i zabranu gotovine, ili će se boriti za svoju slobodu i tražiti bolji život uz možda neke druge donosioce odluka.